This story I'm about to tell you is something that fills me with shame. But more than shame, it terrifies me. It's one of those things I never imagined would happen to me, and even now, when I relive it in my mind, I can't believe I went through it. The worst part is that it was because of my ex-boyfriend. Yes, thanks to him, I almost lost my life. My name is Julieta, and what happened to me changed my life forever. Every detail I'm about to share is still fresh in my memory, as if it happened yesterday. It all started quite innocently, or at least that's what I thought at first. I was in a relationship with a guy named Diego. We had been together for a little over a year. At the beginning, he seemed like the perfect guy, funny, outgoing, always had money and interesting plans. But as the relationship progressed, I began to notice strange things I preferred to ignore. I didn't exactly know what he did for work. Although he would talk about businesses he managed on his own. He never gave me many details, and honestly, I didn't ask much either. I let myself be carried away by the comfortable life he offered, without thinking too much about the consequences. One day, everything started to change. I clearly remember the afternoon Diego called me. It was a regular Tuesday, and I was at home, relaxing after a long day of work. The phone rang, and when I answered, Diego sounded strange, like nervous, almost desperate. He told me he had to leave the country, that he couldn't explain why, but that everything was under control. "It'll only be a few days," he assured me. Although his tone didn't reassure me at all. I tried asking for more details, but his answer was curt. "It's better if you don't know." I was frozen when I heard that. What did he mean by, "it's better if you don't know"? A few days after he left, I began receiving strange messages on my phone. At first, they were simple messages from unknown numbers. "Where is Diego?" "We know who you are." Things that, at the time, I thought could be mistakes or someone messing around. But then those messages became more direct, darker. I started receiving texts like, "You're going to pay for what he owes us," or "You won't escape this." My heart began to beat faster every time I read one of those texts. Something wasn't right, and even though Diego had promised that everything was under control, I had no idea what I had gotten myself into. I remember one night while I was driving home from work, I had that uncomfortable feeling that someone was following me. I looked in my car's rearview mirror and saw the same car behind me, too close for comfort. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but as I took different streets, the car was still there, always behind me, turning at every corner I did. My stomach churned and the fear began to grow inside me. I decided not to go directly home. Instead, I drove around the neighborhood, trying to lose whoever was following me. But the car stayed behind me. I didn't dare stop. Finally, I decided to go home, hoping it was just a coincidence and that it was all paranoia. When I got home, I locked all the doors and tried to calm down, but the fear wouldn't go away. I spent the night awake, listening to every little sound, waiting for someone to knock on the door at any moment. That constant fear became part of my life over the next few weeks. Every day I received more messages. The text didn't stop, and what initially seemed like vague threats had now become much more personal. They knew exactly where I lived, what time I left, and what time I came back. The messages were explicit. "We know where you live. If Diego doesn't show up, you will pay." I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to block the numbers, but every time I did, new ones would appear. I felt like I couldn't escape, but I also couldn't tell anyone. I was too scared and ashamed to admit that all of this was Diego's fault, and my own decisions had brought me here. One night, around 11, I was watching TV when I heard a loud knock on the door of my apartment. My body tensed immediately. I knew this wasn't a normal visit. It was them, the same people who had been sending me messages. I couldn't think of anything else. Fear paralyzed me. At first, I tried not to make a sound, hoping they would think no one was home. But the knock came again, this time louder. "Julieta, open the door," said a deep, raspy voice from the other side. I froze. My first instinct was to hide. I knew I shouldn't open the door. Something inside me screamed not to. I crept quietly to a window that faced the street, trying to see who was outside without being seen. What I saw made my heart stop completely. There were 3 men. They were dressed in black, with hoods partially covering their faces. They didn't look like common thieves, and from the way they were looking at the house, I knew they weren't there by accident. The knocks on the door became more insistent. "We know you're in there. Open now or things will get worse," one of them shouted. My mind was in panic. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't think clearly. I had my phone in my hand, but I didn't dare call the police. What was I going to tell them? That my ex-boyfriend owed them money and now they wanted me? Before I could decide what to do, I heard the most terrifying sound I could imagine at that moment. The door broke. They had come in. I hid behind the sofa, trying not to make any noise. My body was shaking uncontrollably. I could hear their heavy footsteps approaching and their voices whispering to each other. I knew they were looking for me. My mind was trying to find a way out, but there was none. I was trapped. One of them finally found me. He yanked me off the floor, grabbing my arm forcefully. My first instinct was to scream, but one of them quickly covered my mouth. "Shut up, if you scream it will be worse," he whispered in my ear. The fear I felt at that moment was indescribable. I was completely helpless. They dragged me out of my apartment and shoved me into a black van that was parked right in front. No one saw anything, no one heard anything. They drove off quickly and I couldn't do anything but pray for it all to end soon. During the ride, they didn't say much, but the few words they did speak were clear enough. "Diego ran off and owes us a lot of money, now you're going to pay it." I tried to explain to them that I had nothing to do with it, that I didn't know where Diego was, but they didn't listen. To them, I was the collateral. I would pay what he owed one way or another. Eventually, we arrived at what looked like an abandoned warehouse in the middle of nowhere. They dragged me inside and threw me on the floor. The place smelled damp, and the darkness only heightened my terror. I knew that whatever was coming wasn't going to be good. They tied my hands and feet, and the leader of the group, a tall, muscular man with a scar on his face, began interrogating me. "Where's Diego?" he asked me over and over again, glaring at me with hatred. I told him the truth, that I didn't know anything, that Diego had left without any explanation, but he didn't believe me. That's when the beatings started. The first blows left me stunned. I felt the pain like an electric shock coursing through my body. One of the men was punching me in the stomach with such force that the air was knocked out of me. My vision blurred, and my mind completely disconnected from what was happening, as if it couldn't accept what I was going through. The leader, that man with the scar on his face, looked at me with disdain while asking me the same question again and again. "Where's Diego?" I kept repeating the same thing. "I don't know, I have no idea," but they didn't believe me. Each time I said I didn't know anything, the punishment intensified. The blows didn't stop. It was as if they were enjoying my suffering, as if the pain they were causing me was their way of taking revenge for what Diego had done to them. I knew they were looking for an answer I couldn't give them. The worst part was that I was completely alone. No one knew what was happening to me, no one knew where I was. The leader gave a signal and one of the men left the room. When he came back, he was holding a small blowtorch. At that moment, my heart stopped. Fear turned into absolute terror. I realized that the beatings were nothing compared to what was coming. I tried to plead with them, to tell them that I didn't know anything, that I had no way of paying what Diego owed them. But they didn't listen. To them, I was the only way to get back what they had been robbed of. The man with the blowtorch approached slowly. He lit it in front of my eyes while the leader smiled with indescribable malice. I could feel the heat of the fire approaching my skin and my whole body tensed, expecting the pain that I knew was coming. I closed my eyes, trying to mentally prepare for what was about to happen, but there's no way to prepare for something like that. The first contact of the fire with my skin was like being plunged into lava, a pain so intense I can't describe it. I screamed with all my strength, but my voice quickly faded. I couldn't escape, I couldn't move. I was a prisoner in my own body. For what seemed like hours, they burned me on my arms, legs, and torso. Small burns that didn't kill me but made me wish for death. Tears streamed down my face, mixed with sweat and the blood from the wounds they had already caused. My mind was broken. I couldn't think of anything but the pain. I could no longer beg. I could no longer speak. All I hoped for was for it all to end once and for all. Finally, they stopped. The leader watched me, his face showing no compassion, only coldness. "You're going to pay one way or another," he said in a monotonous tone. "If not with money, then with your life." Those words remained etched in my head. I knew that if I didn't do something soon, if I didn't find a way to escape, they would kill me. The worst part was, I didn't know how much time I had left before they decided it wasn't worth torturing me anymore. They left me on the ground, tied up and injured. My thoughts were so clouded by pain that I could barely process what was happening. The silence in that warehouse was deafening. The only sound was my ragged breathing and the frantic beating of my heart. I knew that if I didn't act quickly, my life would end there. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. I don't know. Time distorted in that place. My body was exhausted. Every muscle ached, and my mind was in a state of total shock. But at some point I heard something different. Voices. Voices that didn't belong to my captors. At first I thought I was hallucinating, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But no. The voices were real. "Julieta," shouted a voice I recognized instantly. It was my father. I don't know how he had managed it, how he had gotten there, but my father was outside, negotiating with those monsters. My heart filled with a mix of relief and fear. I didn't know what he was saying to them, but if something went wrong, they could kill him too. I heard shouting and hurried movements, and I knew something was happening. After what seemed like an eternity, the men returned to where I was. They yanked me up roughly, cut the ropes binding my hands, and dragged me toward the warehouse exit. I could barely walk, my legs trembling from pain and exhaustion. My wounds burned with every step, but I knew I had to keep going. I couldn't stop. When we got out of the warehouse, I saw him. My father was there with his hands raised, surrounded by those men. He had a look of desperation and fear I had never seen before. I knew he had done everything he could to save me, and then I saw the briefcase in his hands, the briefcase containing the money they demanded. I don't know how he had done it, but he had managed to gather the $100,000 they were asking for. He had sold his 2 trucks, mortgaged the house, and borrowed money from friends and family. He had done everything to save me. I felt so guilty at that moment, knowing that all this had happened because of Diego and his debts. My father had sacrificed everything for me, and I couldn't even look him in the eyes because of the shame and the pain. One of the men took the briefcase and, after counting the money, nodded his head. They released me roughly, pushing me toward my father. I fell to the ground, but he rushed over to me, lifting me gently. In that moment, all I could do was cry in his arms. The relief of being alive was overwhelming, but the trauma of what had happened wouldn't leave me alone. The men got into the van and left, leaving us there in the middle of nowhere. My father held me tightly without saying a word, while I trembled and sobbed, completely shattered. I had survived, but I felt like a part of me had died in that warehouse. At the hospital, the doctors treated me. They bandaged the burns and took care of my wounds. They told me I would recover physically, but they knew the emotional damage would take much longer to heal. I stayed under observation for several days, and during all that time, my father never left my side. I couldn't look at him without feeling a mix of gratitude and guilt. He had saved my life, but at the cost of his own financial stability, his job, his future, all because of something I hadn't directly caused, but that I had somehow allowed to happen. When I finally left the hospital, I tried to resume my life, but everything was different. I was different. The trauma of that experience stayed with me, haunting me at every moment. I couldn't be alone. I couldn't sleep without the lights on. Every time I heard a noise in the house, my heart raced. Any unknown person seemed like a threat. I lived in a constant state of fear, not knowing if I would ever feel safe again. The worst part was that Diego, the man who had caused all of this, had disappeared. He had left the country the same day I was kidnapped, and I never heard from him again. He had escaped, leaving me alone to face the consequences of his actions. He never called me, never wrote to me, never tried to apologize. He simply disappeared, as if he had never existed in my life. I tried to find answers, tried to understand why this had happened to me. I found out that Diego owed a lot of money to a mafia that operated in the country. I never knew the exact details of what he had done, but what I do know is that they used me as collateral. I was their way of collecting a debt he never paid. Since then, my life has never been the same. After leaving the hospital, I tried to rebuild my life, but nothing was the same. Fear was in every corner of my mind, lurking, waiting for the right moment to take hold of me. I couldn't be alone, and every time a strange car passed near my house, I felt my heart leap out of my chest. Any noise in the night made me jump out of bed. The images of the warehouse, of those men, and of the pain wouldn't leave my mind. I knew that the physical wounds would heal, but the emotional trauma was something that would stay with me for a long time. The days went by, and although my physical wounds began to heal, every time I looked at the burns on my arms, it was as if I was back in that warehouse. Every scar was a reminder of how close I had come to losing my life. And the worst part was that it had all been because of someone who had been my partner, someone I had trusted. I tried to continue with my routine, but it wasn't easy. I had to temporarily leave my job. I couldn't focus, and the simple act of leaving the house caused me panic. My father, despite everything he had lost, never stopped supporting me. He knew I was going through hell, but he never blamed me. It wasn't just the financial sacrifice that weighed on me, but knowing I had caused him so much pain. Every time I looked at him, I could see the worry and exhaustion on his face, but he kept being strong for me. I tried to find out what had happened to Diego, not because I wanted to see him, but because I needed answers. I wanted to know why he had abandoned me. How could he leave and let me face those men alone? I contacted some mutual friends, but no one knew anything about him. It seemed like he had disappeared off the map. The only information I was able to get was that he had fled to Mexico, and that he was probably in even more trouble over there. But I didn't care anymore what happened to him. What hurt me was that he never found out what they did to me because of him. Every day that passed, my mind kept reliving the hours I spent in that warehouse. The sound of the blows, the smell of metal burning my skin, the sharp pain of the wounds. Everything was still there, like a constant echo. I had nightmares almost every night. I dreamt that the men were coming back, that they hadn't left, that they still wanted to kill me. I would wake up screaming, drenched in cold sweat, and it would take hours to calm down. My father convinced me to go to therapy, something I didn't want to do at first. I felt like nothing could help me forget what had happened, but after several panic attacks and sleepless nights, I finally agreed. It was the best decision I could have made. The therapist helped me confront my fears, to talk about what had happened without feeling guilty or ashamed. She made me understand that what happened to me wasn't my fault, that I wasn't responsible for Diego's debts or his bad decisions. But recovery was slow, very slow. Talking about what happened didn't make the pain go away immediately, but at least it helped me process it. Over and over I relived every moment of my kidnapping, but little by little, each time I told the story, the pain became a little more bearable. I remember there was one session where I broke down in uncontrollable tears. We were talking about the scars, about how every mark on my body reminded me of what I had lived through. It wasn't just the physical pain, but the emotional pain as well. I felt broken, shattered inside, as if I could never go back to being the person I was before I met Diego. I felt dirty, marked by something I couldn't erase. My therapist told me that those scars shouldn't be seen as a weakness, but as proof of my strength. I had survived something that few people could endure. With time, I began to reclaim some parts of my life. I returned to work, although there were still days when fear paralyzed me. Every time I walked past a dark alley or saw someone who remotely resembled one of the men who kidnapped me, the terror would come flooding back, as if I were back in that warehouse. But I kept going. I had to. I knew that although I would never forget what happened, I couldn't let them control my life forever. One day my father and I were sitting in our living room. We had avoided talking about the ordeal for a long time, both of us trying to move on. But that afternoon he broke the silence. He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. It wasn't just concern, it was pain. "Julieta," he said softly, "I never asked you to tell me everything they did to you." His words hit me hard. I knew he wanted to know, that he needed to understand what had happened, but I also knew it wasn't easy to share. Talking about what those men had done to me, about the pain and fear I had felt, meant reopening a wound that hadn't fully healed. I took a deep breath, and for the first time I told him everything. Every punch, every burn, every cruel word they said to me. I told him how I had felt like my life was going to end in that place. I left nothing out. As I spoke, I could see the tears welling up in my father's eyes. He didn't say anything, just listened, letting me release everything I had been holding inside. When I finished, he hugged me tightly. For the first time in a long time, I felt like the weight of everything that had happened was starting to lessen, even if only a little. Months went by, and although my life was still marked by what had happened, I began to find a new balance. I never heard from Diego again. He had disappeared completely, and although at one point I considered searching for him to confront him, I decided it wasn't worth it. He no longer had any control over my life. I had survived without him, and that was the only thing that mattered. My father, despite having lost so much for me, never made me feel guilty. He would repeat over and over again that his only concern was that I was alive. He had sold his 2 trucks, mortgaged the house, and still, all that mattered to him was that I was safe. I will never be able to repay everything he did for me, but every day I try to live in a way that makes him feel like his sacrifice wasn't in vain. Today, although I'm still struggling with the memories, I know that I'm stronger than I ever thought I could be. The scars on my body remind me of what I went through, but they also remind me that I survived. And although I can't erase the past, I can move forward. This experience changed me forever, but it also made me more aware of the choices I make and the people I trust. This story, though painful, is a part of me. And while it will never stop being terrifying, by sharing it, I feel like I'm taking back control. I'm not the same person I was before I met Diego, but maybe that's a good thing. I'm a 25-year-old woman from South Africa, and this is the story of my abusive ex and his even more abusive family. All of these events took place over a 6-year period, when I was between 17 and 23 years old. And the worst part is that not many people know my story. And soon you'll understand why. I know all of this is in the past, but it still affects me a lot and has completely changed me. 6 years of my life were wasted and ruined, and my story is quite long, so please bear with me. For my story, I will use fake names for everyone, and I won't mention my real name either. I don't want to bore you with the first part, so to summarize, when I was 16, my mom and I used to live with my aunt, who is my mom's sister, and her husband. One day, out of nowhere, when I came back from school and entered the yard, my mom told me we were moving. For some reason, my aunt's husband had kicked both of us out, and to this day, I have no idea why. So that year, at the end of November, we moved and ended up living with my mom's brother. I'll call him Uncle Ramon. The following year, in January, my uncle started looking for a school for me in the surrounding area. According to my Uncle Ramon, all the nearby schools were full, and the other schools were too far away. But personally, I don't think that was the case. I think he just didn't want to enroll me in a school because he knew he'd have to pay for all my school supplies and other things. At the time, he was taking care of another girl who was 6 or 7 years younger than me and wasn't even family. She was the daughter of my uncle's ex-wife's ex-boyfriend. But when he met this girl, whom I'll call Allison, he got very attached to her and adopted her because her family couldn't help her with her schoolwork, so she was doing very poorly in school. It breaks my heart to say that my uncle loved her more than he loved me or his own family. He treated her like a goddess. He gave her everything she wanted, and she was extremely spoiled. Since he was already taking care of someone he treated like a princess, I don't think he was willing to do the same for me. So he told me I had to go out and find a job. So off I went. I was 16, about to turn 17 in October that year, and I had to go look for work. Fortunately, my mom's other sister was also living with us at my uncle's house at that time, and she was a manager at a local grocery store. The two bosses loved her, so she got me a job there as a cleaner. And if I thought my life was going downhill at that point, I was very wrong. I started working on the 5th of February, and life just went on, working long, terrible hours for a miserable salary, having conflicts with coworkers who harassed me and more. I worked there the whole year and everything was fine. The following year, I started noticing a guy who would come to the store almost every day to buy groceries. Some days he was alone, other days he was with another guy whom I later found out was his cousin and had special needs. He was older than the first guy, so this guy and I, whom I'll call Jose, and his cousin with special needs, David, would see each other. Jose and I began noticing each other more and more every time he came to the store. Eventually, we started greeting each other, then talking, hugging when we saw each other, and finally exchanging contacts and talking over the phone. Now, without adding more boring details, we became best friends and then started dating. We began our relationship at the end of that same year, on December 26, 2015. To be precise, basically a little more than a year after we had moved. So right at the beginning of the last week of December 2015, I went to Jose's house. At the time, he lived with his mother, Wendy, and his special needs cousin, whom I mentioned before, David. They lived in a small complex consisting of 6 units per complex. The initial plan was to stay for the week, spend New Year's there, and then go back home. But when the week ended, we were both sad about the idea of being apart, so he begged my mom to let me stay another week, and she said yes. It kept going like that, and eventually I ended up moving in with them. By then, essentially, a month had passed, and I hadn't been back home since the previous year, which was 2015. So I had been there since a week before 2016 and up until then. Mrs. Wendy, Jose's mother, had a disease that essentially consumes all your muscles and other things over the years, leaving you disabled. When I first started living with them, the disease hadn't affected her much yet. she could still move around with crutches. At first, she liked me a lot. She would take me to work every morning and we would talk about everything. But around the middle of the year, she started treating me badly. Not too much, but enough for me to notice she was starting to hold a grudge against me. Before that, during those months, I had met Jose's older sister, Lucia, and her wife, Miriam. They were also kind to me. 2 more months passed, and Mrs. Wendy started hating me more and more for some reason, even to the point of confronting my ex, Jose, about some of the things he was doing that annoyed her. Things I didn't even know about. I would just hear Jose and his mother yelling at each other with my name in the middle of their words. I stayed there, not knowing what the hell I had done wrong, and she would even call Lucia on the phone to rant about how we were bothering them, and would call us things like trash and pieces of crap, words that really hurt me deeply. But don't think Jose was an angel, because although he would defend me from his mother's absurd accusations, there were also many times when we fought and argued, and when that happened, he would sometimes physically abuse me. He would push me, lift me up by the neck and throw me, or sometimes he would get up close to me, clenching his teeth while yelling aggressively at me, all the while with that fierce look in his eyes. This started happening about 3 months after I moved in with them, and to be honest, we fought a lot, and I mean almost constantly. And every time he abused me, I remembered my mom's words. When a man raises his hand to you the first time, walk away from him as soon as possible because he'll only keep doing it. But stupidly, I never wanted to leave because I loved him and always thought he wouldn't do it again, and each time I was wrong. I never wanted to tell my mom because I knew she would have pulled me out of that situation by force, and I still hate myself for not leaving sooner. Another month passed, and we were still in the middle of 2016 when Lucia and her wife came to visit. That's when they told their mother that Lucia's job wanted to transfer her to KZN, which is basically another name for Durban. We were living in Johannesburg at the time, so for the rest of 2016, the family made plans and arrangements to move to KZN, and we spent time tidying up the house, packing, and all that. And obviously I was going with them, so I had to quit my job. But I think I quit too soon because there were still about 4 to 6 months left in that year. Maybe I'm not very precise on this, but it's what I remember. I also remember that my mom spent Christmas with us at Jose's house that year, and she left the next day. Then New Year's came, and that was the first time Lucia started treating me the way her mother did. That night she was drunk and angry about the things her mother had said about me during the year, and she ended up yelling at me, literally getting in my face and shouting things like, "I hate you, I hate you," over and over again. She even physically attacked Jose, and her wife Miriam, who was completely crazy, also got into the fight, yelling at us and attacking us. All of this happened on the last day of December 2016, just a few hours before 2017 began. After quitting my job in 2016, I started cleaning Mrs. Wendy's house in exchange for a salary and also helped Jose take care of his mother. As her illness was worsening, and she was too heavy for him to lift on his own, he would put her in a wheelchair and then have to lift her again to take her to the bathroom, bed, or wherever she wanted to be. So all of this was happening, and my life was only getting harder and more complicated. Finally, the year 2016 ended. The fights and everything I mentioned before happened, and 2017 came. A few months after the new year started, we finally moved to KZN, and honestly, I'm crying as I write this. I guess that's how I felt when I had to leave my mom behind. I wasn't happy, but I had to make a choice, and I made a terrible decision. I'll summarize this part a bit too. We all moved to KZN, the 7 of us, because it was me, Jose, Lucia and her wife Miriam, Mrs. Wendy, Jose and Lucia's cousin, and an older lady who I think was Mrs. Wendy's aunt or something like that. Anyway, we moved, and life only got worse. Jose never stopped physically abusing me when we fought or argued. Sometimes it got to the point where I hurt myself out of frustration when we fought. One day, I hit my head so hard against the wall that for a brief second when my head hit the wall, my vision went blank, if that makes sense. Sometimes Lucia and Jose would fight too, or Lucia would fight with her cousin or Jose with his cousin. It was all really a mess. When I say they fought, I mean they would yell at each other like crazed animals. I'm extremely sensitive to fights and yelling, and my heart can't take it. Their fights scared me so much that even if someone speaks to me in too loud of a tone now, I feel like I'm going to have a panic attack and start crying. That's one of the things I was referring to earlier when I said they changed me a lot. Another thing that also changed me was that when I spoke to Lucia and my voice was too loud for her, She would yell at me and tell me I needed to lower my attitude towards her and things like that. And that was when I didn't even have an attitude. I just wanted her to listen because sometimes she wouldn't hear me talking and would ask me to speak up. But every time I did, that was her reaction to me. Since we moved to KZN, Lucia also started yelling at me and calling me all kinds of ugly names. She would literally abuse me almost every day. And one day she told me that since I wasn't working, my mom would have to pay rent for me to live there every month, or else I'd have to leave. She basically forced us into it, and at the same time they made me work as a maid in the house all by myself. So really, they should have been paying me for being their domestic worker, not the other way around. My mom told me she couldn't give them more than 1,000 rand per month because that's all she had, which for anyone wondering is about $50. They didn't like it, but they accepted it, and then that became an issue too. Lucia would also fight with me, saying my mom was so useless that she couldn't even give more than 1,000 rand per month, and that the monthly groceries cost much more than that. That didn't include rent, electricity, and everything else, but they never understood that was all my mom could give. She didn't work, she just received a pension, and she also had to buy her own necessities. According to South African law, no one is allowed to take money from a pensioner. At least that's what I've heard, even the bank isn't allowed to do it. In fact, you can take someone to court for doing it. Every cent my mom sent me, Lucia and the others took. They never bought me shampoo, deodorant, or anything else. And even when my mom sent money for me to buy those things myself, they kept it. Sometimes I had to wash my hair with dish soap because I didn't have shampoo, and I had to use toilet paper for protection during my period. They constantly took my money, forced me to clean the house, and fought with me over petty things. Sometimes they would tell me to do one thing, and halfway through they would call me to do something else, which took quite a bit of time. And when I finished, I'd go back to do the first task, and then they would fight and complain about why the first task wasn't done. But they kept me so busy with the other task that I didn't have time to finish the first one. After we moved to KZN, we stayed in that house for a month, and then we moved again, still in the same city, just to another suburb or town or whatever, because the first house had too many stairs for Jose's mother as she couldn't walk. At that point, she was fully in a wheelchair. The disease had taken its toll on her. Sometimes when it came to me, she would start arguments about things I didn't even know about, and then Lucia would continue the fight, yelling at me, cursing me, and mentally abusing me again. We stayed in the second house for a year, and the following year, a few months later, Miriam, Lucia's wife, decided she wanted a monkey. By then, I had lost track of what year it was. The monkey she wanted was one of those small capuchin monkeys. Miriam promised in every way possible that she would stop drinking alcohol and smoking weed if she got one. And yes, I didn't mention this before, but both Lucia and Miriam were alcoholics and weed addicts. Those two things were their daily obsession. Every day they drank alcohol and smoked weed, and not just one bottle. Their minimum was at least 3 or 4 bottles a day. When they talked to Mrs. Wendy about it, she refused, but they went behind her back and did it anyway, and only told her when the monkey was already in our house in its cage. Mrs. Wendy was furious, but eventually she accepted it. I, on the other hand, didn't want anything to do with the monkey. Miriam took care of it as she had promised, but not completely. She didn't quit alcohol or weed as she had promised, and some days they would throw parties with friends and alcohol, and I was forced to take care of that damn animal. I couldn't say no, and then it became a regular thing for me to care for it. At first, I just had to help change its diaper. Then occasionally they would call me from wherever I was to do it. Then I had to start making its food and preparing its milk bottle, as it only drank baby formula. Then I had to clean its cage every day, take out the blankets and stuffed animals, and put in clean ones. I even had to start taking care of it when those two, who the monkey actually belonged to, went out to clubs, drinking and partying. The monkey became my full responsibility, and I hated it because it wasn't my animal. I didn't want to be a part of it, and I didn't ask to care for it or do everything for it. I didn't ask for it, and I didn't care. I know that probably sounds cruel, but I just don't like monkeys. They're not my thing. Over time, however, it became more and more my responsibility. When Lucia was at work, her wife Miriam would sleep all day, and I was left alone cleaning the entire house, doing the laundry, and fully taking care of the monkey. I would give it milk, water, food, and attention, and its real owner would just sleep all day. Even when Lucia came home from work, she would give the monkey attention but would order me to bring it food, water, chips, and more. She barely lifted a finger to do any of those things, not even cleaning the house. She thought that because she had a job, she was too good to clean the house and bring food and snacks for her monkey or do anything really. And it didn't matter if I was sick, tired, or depressed. I still had to do everything. They would just tell me to get over it. A few months after they got the monkey, Mrs. Wendy ended up in the hospital because her illness made it difficult for her to swallow. For a few weeks, maybe even a month or two, she was in and out of the hospital. Eventually, one day, she went in and never came out. They said she died and was resuscitated, but after that, she was never the same. She ended up in a vegetative state. Machines were the only things keeping her breathing. Eventually, they had to disconnect her. Before they did, each of us stood by her bed and spoke to her. She could hear you, but she couldn't move. Even after how she treated and disrespected me, I was still by her side, showing that I cared. I don't think she cared much, but still. We were all really depressed and cried, but eventually we went back home, and life went on, though not much changed. The only thing that changed was that everyone who used to live with us started moving out one by one until only the four of us remained. Me, Jose, his sister Lucia, and her wife Miriam. And of course, the stupid monkey and the dogs and cats. I admit that Lucia calmed down a bit after her mother passed away. She was less aggressive, but there were still fights between her and Jose and between her and her wife. She became more bossy with me, giving me orders more often, telling me what to do, etc. After a while, they got a second monkey, a female. So I had double the responsibility, which depressed me even more. My anxiety was through the roof, and depression started taking over me seriously. I can't remember how much longer we lived in that house before we moved again. We stayed in the new house, but everything remained the same. They kept mentally abusing me, and Jose kept physically abusing me. Nothing new there. The abuse was a little less, but it was still present. My depression worsened because of the abuse and also because they kept treating me like their maid. Right after Christmas, we moved again. This time we moved into a huge house. Jose also got a job, and I ended up taking care of the monkeys completely on my own. By then, I think it was 2021, because when COVID hit, we were still living in the third house, the one I mentioned before. Every day, I wished I could be free. Eventually, I ended up telling my mom everything, except for Jose's physical abuse. I only told her about that later, after I had left that abusive life. She couldn't believe it, and she started feeling sad about the circumstances I was in. But she still supported me. I remember constantly nagging and insisting to Jose that we should move to our own place since we didn't have to take care of his mother after she passed away. But he always brushed off the idea or told me we didn't have money, to which I replied that we could go live with my mom and my uncle and work from there. Even my uncle Ramon suggested it, but Jose just wouldn't budge. That's when I knew he was too attached to his sister, and that it would never happen. That only added to my depression, and the constant fights between Lucia and Miriam also got on my nerves. One day in that big house we lived in, the two of them were drunk again, and Jose was at work. Lucia and Miriam were arguing over a small sip of beer. Lucia had promised Miriam she would buy her a whole bottle if she let her take a small sip. Miriam refused, and the two of them grabbed the glass and started tugging it back and forth. Suddenly, Miriam yanked the glass out of Lucia's hand and then hit her in the face with it. The glass shattered as it hit Lucia's face, cutting her in several places. There was beer and a pool of blood everywhere. Only when Miriam saw the extent of the damage she had caused to Lucia's face did she start to worry. On other occasions, they physically attacked each other, fighting on the ground, pulling each other's hair. It was crazy, and with my intense anxiety, I had to witness all of it. And as if things couldn't get worse in that same big house we lived in, the monkeys started attacking me every time I got near them. The first time, they grabbed me by the ankle as I was walking away and bit me. The wound was so deep that my whole shoe was soaked in blood, and it became extremely difficult to walk because it hurt so much. After that, they would occasionally attack me, but when we moved to our final house after that Christmas, the attacks became more frequent. The monkeys would cry for water, and when I gave it to them, they would scratch my arms or bite me if I got too close. The only thing I could do was clean the blood and bandage the wounds. Usually when they did that, I would just leave them without water because instead of drinking it, they would attack me. It started happening every day. I just couldn't do anything for them anymore. But they still forced me to take care of them while Jose and Lucia were at work, and Miriam was always sleeping. Everyone knew the monkeys were attacking me, and the only thing they said was, sorry. Every morning when Lucia and Jose woke up at 6 a.m. to get ready for work, I had to find both of their work clothes and prepare their lunches, all while Miriam was either asleep or smoking a cigarette with Lucia. Lucia wouldn't even get her own wife's clothes. I had to run back and forth every morning for them. After they left, Miriam would go back to bed to sleep, and I was left alone again, cleaning, taking care of the annoying monkeys, doing more laundry and more. That last year, my depression really hit me, and I just didn't want to live anymore. I wanted to die. It was so bad that I lost a lot of weight. I went from wearing a size 32 pants to a size 28. I don't know if sizes are the same in the US, but here a size 28 is super small. I didn't care much about the weight loss because I finally felt good enough about myself to wear crop tops. It's not that I was fat, but I wasn't comfortable with my body. I felt fat, though I really wasn't. But anyway, that's how bad my depression was at that point. I didn't even love Jose the way I used to, not the same way. By then, I just wanted to be rid of the pain in any way possible. Toward the end of the year, my mom needed surgery to remove a cataract from her eye, and she needed my help because she was blind in one eye, and the eye that needed surgery was her good eye. The reason she needed my help was because she was cleaning Uncle Ramon's house, preparing dinner, and taking care of, who would have guessed, her sister, the same aunt whose husband kicked us out in the first place. Both my aunt and her husband lived there now too, and my mom's other sister, the one who was the manager at the store where I worked, also moved to KZN to live with her boyfriend, who is now her husband. I forgot to mention that my mom's other sister and her husband also lived there when I was there, but when my aunt moved to KZN, my other aunt and her husband moved into the apartment where they used to live. Now I never liked my aunt's husband because he's a pervert. Once he cornered me and touched me inappropriately, but I never told anyone about it. So, when my aunt and her pervert husband moved into the available apartment, there was a spare bedroom in the house, and that's the bedroom my aunt and her husband, who kicked us out, live in now. So, my mom and I discussed my situation and how I could help her, until I told her that I didn't want to go back once I was in Johannesburg again. That's when we planned my escape. If Lucia had known that I wasn't going to return, she wouldn't have let me leave. So, we told them that I was only going to help my mom until her eye healed. When we told Lucia about it, she immediately said she knew my mom wouldn't give me back, and I just lied and told her I would return. I had to pack some of my things in black trash bags and then hide them outside in the garden. When my mom and Uncle Ramon arrived, I snuck out and we quickly loaded the bags into the car. Then I went back in through the back door and walked out the front door as if nothing had happened. My mom and uncle came in, greeted everyone, and then we loaded my 2 or 3 remaining bags into the car. I said my goodbyes and we left. It's a 6-hour drive from Johannesburg to KZN, so my uncle didn't want to waste time, and that's why I didn't take my Xbox with me. Both Jose and I had our own consoles, but I never got mine back. I was stupid for leaving it behind. It was actually stolen by one of Jose's friends, and he refused to replace it. I got a new one secondhand, and it worked for a while, but then it stopped working. It turns on, but it doesn't show any image on the TV at all, and I feel very depressed about that because I don't have the financial means to buy a new one. The job I have doesn't pay much, and it would take me years to save up for a new one. But aside from that, to make a long story short, I moved back in with my mom and uncle, and I had to leave more than half of my things behind. I lost so much with that family, not just material things, but also myself. It was in December of 2022 when I returned home. After I got home, I waited a few days and then broke up with Jose. He remained obsessed with me for most of the following year, but eventually he left me alone. During that year, I went to visit my best friend, whom I hadn't seen in 10 years, and while I was there, I met a new guy who also lived in the same area as her. We exchanged numbers and started talking. We became very close, and after some time talking, I told him straight up that I liked him and wanted to be with him. He felt the same way, and in October, we started dating. I told him about my life, and he literally wanted to kill my ex. We visited each other constantly, and my family met him and loved him. My life was perfect. But then, unfortunately, in August of 2023, my mom passed away. It really devastated and broke me completely. I had never cried so much in my life. Even my new boyfriend, whom I'll call Joel, couldn't believe it. My uncle then wanted me to take my mom's place, meaning I had to clean the house, make dinner, and take care of my disabled aunt and her lazy husband. I told Joel about this, and he said there was no way that was going to happen. He told me to come live with him, and that's exactly what I did. Uncle Ramon said it was okay, but I can feel that he's not happy about the decision. But Joel doesn't care because he says I'd just be wasting my life if I stayed there instead of being here, building a future with him, which is absolutely true. So I left in September. I also couldn't stand living in the same house where I was so used to having my mom around. I then got a small job at an auction house. I only work 2 days a week, the salary isn't much, but it's enough to buy what I need except, of course, for my Xbox, as I mentioned before. But I can tell you that I haven't been this happy in years. Joel is an amazing man. He's perfect in every way and makes me feel like a true princess, and he treats me like one too. He has never treated me badly in any way, and in the time we've been together, he has given me more in 1 year than my ex gave me in 2 months. His family is incredible, and they are very calm people, even when they are angry. I guess I can say that my mom can rest in peace knowing that I finally found my Prince Charming and that his family is made up of true angels. We still live with his parents, but he's working hard to build a future for us, and so am I. We've been together for 1 year and 4 months, and things are still going great. I've never been this happy. I'm still as in love with him as I was when we first met. I'm sorry that my story turned out to be so long. I had so much to share, and there's still a lot of sadness inside me. The tears I've shed while writing all of this have been many, but I feel better knowing that my story is out there. I just needed people to know. If you've made it to the end, thank you so much. I promise that if I send another story, it won't be as long. And if you're out there trapped in an abusive relationship with a boyfriend, girlfriend, or their family, please leave that situation. I promise you that there is truly someone better waiting for you. I have 3 stories about crazy ex-girlfriends. One was a coworker and was bipolar, which wasn't the issue. But from time to time, she would stop taking her medication. Once, out of nowhere, she came up to me and punched me in the arm. Thanks to the thick material of the jacket we were wearing, it only left a slight bruise, but it hurt. On another occasion, she stopped taking her medication again, but this time she bit my arm. It wasn't a playful bite. She came up and stood next to me for a few minutes. I thought she was looking at the meat fridge when suddenly she turned her head and sank her teeth into my arm. I swear if it weren't for that jacket, she would have left a mark. That hurt a lot too. She didn't work much longer after that. The second story is short, as I don't remember much about her, except that at first I thought she was nice. Besides being rude, she wasn't violent as far as I know. I broke up with her, and later I found out from my sister-in-law that she was a stalker. She would stand on the sidewalk in front of our driveway and just stare at the house in the middle of the night. She only did it a few times and then stopped. I don't know if something scared her off or what. The third story happened between 86 and 87. My mother used to hire people to help clean the house. One of those people was a nice woman whom I talked to while she cleaned. We got along well, or at least I thought we did. We dated for about 6 months or so. That's when I started to see what others had already noticed about her, but they didn't know how to tell me in a way that I would believe. I was in love with her. She was my third girlfriend, and I guess that's why I didn't see her behavior as bad. We never cuddled on the couch, we never kissed. We showered together, but she wouldn't even let me wash her back. In 87, I went near Los Angeles from Oceanside to learn how to drive trucks. She had a job at a bar in Los Angeles. We talked on the phone, and she told me she had quit the job because she knew I didn't want her driving to Los Angeles. I asked if she had another job, and she said no, that I could support her. That was the trigger, so I broke up with her. I later found out that she didn't respect other people's property. The youngest son of my mom's boyfriend lived with us, and he told her not to go into his room. She went in anyway and threw away things he wanted to keep. Once, we went to a friend of hers' house, and she let the cat out. I later found out that her friend had already told her not to let the cat out. On my birthday, I received $5 in a greeting card, and she got mad because I didn't give the money to her. My mom told me after we broke up that she had fired her too. It was more like she seemed to clean the house rather than actually doing it. For several months, she kept coming to the house demanding that I take her back, saying, "What about my feelings? I need you, and you need me." We're talking about 4 months or more. I kept telling her that I didn't know about her feelings, but that's how I felt. Finally, I said, "I don't care about your feelings, we're done. You don't respect yourself or others. Now I see that you never loved me at all." Eventually, she stopped coming. In December of 89, I left California for good and never saw her again. I'm going to tell you the story of the time my ex-boyfriend saved my life. It's something I never thought I'd be able to say out loud, but it's the truth, and I still find it hard to understand how I survived that night. I don't know why he did it, maybe because deep down he always cared about me, even though we were no longer together. Sometimes I think it was just luck, but what happened that night was hell, and I know that if he hadn't been there, I probably wouldn't be telling this story now. My name is Elena, and this story happened a few years ago when I lived in a small town in the United States. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other. The houses were old, and the streets were always half empty. I had moved there after breaking up with my ex-boyfriend, looking for a fresh start, something to help me leave behind the bad memories. At that time, I was in a relationship with someone else, someone who at first seemed perfect but turned out to be the complete opposite. In the beginning, my new relationship was good. We met at a bar in town. He was charming, funny, and made me feel good, but as often happens, everything slowly began to change. Over time, I noticed that he had a drinking problem. He drank too much, and when he did, he became a completely different person. At first, it was just unpleasant comments, yelling for no reason, but over time, the insults turned into punches. Punches that I tried to justify, telling myself it was because he was drunk, that he wasn't really like that. But that night, there was no way to justify what happened. It was a Friday night, and he had come home after spending the whole day drinking with his friends. I was in the kitchen, preparing something for dinner, trying to avoid any confrontation. I knew how he got when he was drunk, and the last thing I wanted was to provoke his fury. I heard the door slam and his heavy footsteps approaching. I immediately knew he was in a bad mood. Something about the way he walked told me. I swallowed hard and forced myself to stay calm. He asked me what I was cooking, and when I answered, he gave me a look of contempt. It wasn't the first time, but that night felt different. He was more aggressive, his words were crueler, and his gaze more empty. He yelled at me, calling me useless, saying I couldn't do anything right. I tried to ignore him, but before I could react, he pushed me against the wall. I felt the impact on my back and the air leave my lungs, but I didn't have time to recover. He jumped on me and started punching me in the face, arms, and stomach. Everything turned into a chaos of pain and fear. I couldn't see clearly because of the tears and the blood that started running down my face. I was screaming, begging him to stop, but it was as if he couldn't hear me. His gaze was lost. I didn't see the man I had started this relationship with, only someone out of control, someone who didn't recognize me. I tried to stand up, to push him away, but he was stronger than me. I felt each blow like a whip, and the worst part was that there was no one who could help me. We were alone, and I couldn't do anything. The minutes felt like an eternity. I was on the floor, unable to move, and he kept hitting me, shouting things I couldn't understand. At some point, everything became blurry. My body stopped responding. I could only feel the punches, one after another, without stopping. It was like being trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I remember closing my eyes and trying to think of something else. Anything but that unbearable pain. I thought about my family, my friends, and how I had gotten to this point. Suddenly I heard a noise, a loud bang at the door, but my mind was so confused that I couldn't figure out what it was. My vision was blurred, everything was spinning, and the sound of my heart pounding was the only thing I could hear. Everything went dark for a moment. I couldn't get up, and all I felt were his hands around my neck, squeezing tighter and tighter. I thought that was where it would all end. I had no strength to fight, not even to scream. At that moment I heard another noise, something that made everything stop for a second. There was a knock on the door, louder than before, and then another. I felt as if something had broken, but I didn't understand what was happening. My boyfriend, the monster he had become, stopped and stared at me, as if he was doubting what he was doing. I took advantage of those seconds to try to catch my breath, but I couldn't move. I was terrified, in shock, not knowing what was going to happen next. Suddenly, the door burst open. My ex-boyfriend, the same guy I had broken up with months before, came running in. He lived next door to our house and had heard my screams. I always thought that after our breakup he wanted nothing more to do with me. But there he was, standing in front of us with an expression I will never forget. He didn't say a word, didn't ask anything. He just launched himself at my boyfriend, hitting him with all the strength he had. I could barely stay conscious, but I managed to see how my ex punched him, one blow after another until he knocked him down. My current boyfriend tried to defend himself, but my ex was so full of rage, so determined, that he knocked him out within seconds. I lay there on the floor, watching as the person who had once been my partner saved my life without a second thought. I couldn't believe what was happening. Everything felt surreal, like a horror movie I was living in. I don't remember much of what happened afterward. The last thing I saw was my boyfriend lying on the floor, unconscious, and my ex trying to lift me up in his arms. I felt his strength, his concern, and I used all the energy I had left to cling to him. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I trusted that he would get me out of there. I couldn't walk, everything hurt, and every breath was torture. Blood ran down my face and arms, and I was so dizzy that I could barely keep my eyes open. My ex took me to the hospital as fast as he could. He told me later that he was talking to me the whole way, asking me not to close my eyes, to hold on just a little longer. I could barely hear him, but somewhere in my mind, those words helped me not to lose consciousness completely. When we arrived, the doctors attended to me immediately, and that's when I finally passed out. The next thing I knew, I woke up in a hospital bed surrounded by machines and bandages all over my body. When I opened my eyes, I saw him, my ex-boyfriend, sitting in the corner of the room. He was covered in blood, his knuckles swollen and his gaze lost. He told me what had happened, how he had heard my screams and didn't hesitate to come to see what was going on. He said that when he arrived, I was unconscious on the floor, and my boyfriend, or rather the man who was killing me, was sitting at the table drinking a beer, as if nothing had happened. That's when my ex jumped on him and beat him until he knocked him out. My injuries were severe. I had broken ribs, a battered face, and was covered in bruises and cuts. The fear I felt in those moments was indescribable, but so was the relief of knowing I was safe, thanks to someone who, despite everything, still cared about me. After that night, things changed drastically. My boyfriend, the one who had beaten me nearly to death, disappeared. The police searched for him everywhere, but they never found him. Some said he fled the town, others that he was hiding somewhere nearby, but the truth is no one knew for sure where he was. Living with that uncertainty, with the fear that he could show up at any moment, was something that haunted me for a long time. My ex-boyfriend, the guy who saved my life, stayed by my side through it all. He helped me recover, helped me overcome the fear, and even though we never got back together as a couple, I will always be grateful to him for what he did. Without him, I wouldn't be here telling this story. To this day, I still don't know what caused my boyfriend to become that violent and out-of-control person. Sometimes I wonder if he had always been that way and I just never saw it, or if something broke inside him and made him cross that line. Not that it excuses him, because there's no justification for what he did, but it's hard not to think about all the signs I ignored, all the moments I wanted to believe it was just a rough patch or that things would get better. After that episode, I moved out of that town. I couldn't keep living with the constant fear that he might show up at any moment. Every time I heard a noise on the street, every time someone knocked on the door, my heart would stop. I moved, hoping to start over, but even now, in the darkest nights, that fear is still there, lurking in the back of my mind. My ex, the one who saved me, went on with his life. We stay in touch, although we don't see each other as much as we used to. Every now and then, he sends me messages to check on me, to make sure everything is okay. And even though we've gone our separate ways, I will always be grateful to him for what he did, because without his bravery and intervention, my story would have ended very differently. After moving away from that town, I tried to rebuild my life, but it wasn't easy. The trauma from that night stayed with me for a long time. Every loud noise, every unexpected knock on the door would send me into a panic. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, always fearing that my ex might return. It was hard to trust people again, especially men. I spent months in therapy, trying to work through the fear, the anxiety, and the emotional scars that were left behind. The physical wounds healed, but the emotional ones took much longer. Despite the fear, moving away gave me the space I needed to start fresh. I found a new job, made new friends, and began to piece my life back together. But I couldn't shake the memories of that night or the gratitude I felt for the person who saved me. My ex and I never rekindled our relationship, but I often thought about how different things might have been if he hadn't been there. He didn't owe me anything after all. We had broken up, but he still chose to step in and save me when I needed it the most. The guy who attacked me was never caught, and that has been one of the hardest parts to live with. I don't know where he is or what happened to him, and that uncertainty has haunted me. For a long time, I was afraid he'd show up again, angry and vengeful. I lived in constant fear that he'd find me, that he'd finish what he started. But as the years have gone by, that fear has slowly faded. I've built a new life, surrounded by people who care about me, and I'm no longer the terrified woman I was back then. Looking back now, I see how lucky I was that my ex heard my screams and took action. I was so close to losing everything, and it could have easily gone the other way. But that night also taught me something important about myself. I'm a survivor. No matter how scared or broken I felt, I made it through. And while the experience left deep scars, it also made me stronger. I share this story not just to acknowledge the man who saved me, but to remind others that there's always hope, even in the darkest moments. There are people out there who will step up, who will be there for you when you need them most, even if you don't expect it. And if you're ever in a situation where you feel trapped, where you feel like there's no escape, know that you're not alone. There is always a way out, and there are people who care. Today I've moved on from that dark chapter in my life. I'm in a much better place now, emotionally and mentally. I've learned to trust again, and I've even found love with someone who treats me with kindness and respect. Someone who understands what I've been through and supports me in every way. And while the trauma of that night will always be a part of my past, it no longer controls my present. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, please remember that help is out there, and you are worth saving. Don't be afraid to reach out for support, whether it's from friends, family, or even an ex who you thought no longer cared. Sometimes the people who care the most are the ones we least expect.